They say the mate bond is a promise written in the stars, but for the rejected, it is a sentence written in blood. That is where Alara's nightmare begins. The day the wedding bells rang for Alpha Jax was the day the sacred laws of the pack proved to be nothing but cruel jokes. For years, Alara had viewed her Omega nature as a gift, a soft refuge for a strong leader. She had clung to the innocent belief that her kindness was a strength, that her loyalty would be rewarded with love, and that the white dress she dreamed of wearing would symbolize a new beginning as a Luna. But innocence is a dangerous thing when you love a man who craves power more than a soulmate. Instead of standing at the altar, Alara stood in the shadows of the kitchen, her hands trembling around a heavy silver tray. The white dress she wore wasn't a bridal gown, it was a mockery, a servant's uniform intended to humiliate her before the entire pack. As the cheers for the new couple drifted through the walls, Alara realized that hoping for mercy was useless. She had to walk out there, face the man who shattered her, and pour wine for the terrifying guest of honor waiting in the dark. Please subscribe and hit the share button and comment for more stories. The double doors to the banquet hall swung open, and the roar of the celebration hit Alara like a physical blow. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, expensive perfume, and the overwhelming, heady musk of hundreds of shifting wolves. For a moment, she stood frozen on the threshold, the heavy silver tray trembling in her hands, the wine glasses clinking softly against each other, a tiny, fragile sound against the raucous laughter of the pack. She had hoped to slip in unnoticed, a ghost in the periphery, but the white dress made that impossible. It was a simple thing of rough cotton, not silk, but the color was a deliberate, stinging insult. In a room full of jewel tones and velvet, the white marked her. It was the color of the bride she was supposed to be, twisted into the uniform of the servant she had become. Heads turned. The laughter nearest the door died down, rippling outward until the silence reached the high table. Alpha Jax stood at the center of the dais, one hand resting possessively on the waist of his new mate, a sharp-eyed female named Lena who wore the pack's colors with a smug satisfaction. Jax looked devastatingly handsome in his charcoal suit, the very picture of a benevolent leader, until his eyes landed on Alara. The warmth instantly evaporated from his face, replaced by a cruel, amused glint. He didn't ignore her. That would have been a mercy. Instead, he tapped his spoon against his champagne flute, the sharp ting-ting-ting cutting through the remaining murmurs. "Silence, everyone," Jax commanded, his voice smooth and projecting easily to the back of the hall. He gestured toward the door with his glass. "It seems we have a late arrival to the service staff." Alara's cheeks burned. She lowered her gaze to the floorboards, trying to make herself small, but Jax wasn't finished. "I was just speaking about the strength of our pack," Jax continued, stepping down from the dais and walking slowly toward her. The crowd parted for him, eager to watch the alpha toy with the rejected Omega. Strength comes from order. From hierarchy. From everyone understanding exactly what they are worth. He stopped a few feet away from her. The smell of his cologne, sandalwood and rain, wafted over her, a scent that used to make her heart race. Now, it only made her stomach turn. "To knowing your place," Jax said softly, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To knowing your place," the pack echoed, a chorus of sycophants laughing at her expense. Jax took a sip, his eyes dancing with malice. He leaned in close, whispering so only she could hear. "You look ridiculous in that dress, Alara. Like a child playing pretend." Then, he pulled back, his voice booming again. "But we are gracious hosts, aren't we? And we must ensure our most distinguished guest is well taken care of." Alara's breath hitched. She knew who he meant. Everyone knew. Jax pointed a finger toward the far corner of the room, a shadowed alcove where the light from the chandeliers didn't quite reach. A single figure sat there on a high-backed velvet chair that looked more like a throne. The space around him was empty, a wide perimeter of fear kept even the bravest warriors at a distance. "The Leakin King looks thirsty," Jax announced, a cruel smile stretching his lips. He knew the rumors. He knew the king was said to tear the throats out of those who displeased him. Jax was betting on her fear. He wanted to see her drop the tray. He wanted to see her weep. Go on, Omega. Fill his glass. Unless you're too afraid to approach a real alpha? Alara looked into the shadows. She couldn't see the king's face, only the broad, intimidating outline of his shoulders and the stillness of a predator waiting to strike. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Go, Jack snapped, his amusement sharpening into a command. Alara swallowed the lump in her throat, tightened her grip on the silver tray, and took the first step toward the darkness. The distance between the dais and the shadowed alcove was only 20 paces, but it felt like walking across a frozen lake. One wrong step, and she would drown. The heavy velvet of the crowd's silence pressed against her back, every eye in the room burning into her spine. They were waiting for her to trip, to spill the wine, to give them one last reason to sneer before the night was over. But as Alara stepped past the perimeter of the dance floor and into the king's orbit, the jeering crowd seemed to vanish. The air here was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was still, like the center of a storm. The temperature dropped sharply, raising gooseflesh on her bare arms. On the small table beside the velvet chair, the flame of a single taper candle flickered violently, though there was no draft. It danced as if terrified, bowing before the man who sat in the dark. Alara forced her legs to keep moving until she stood directly beside the high-backed chair. King Alaric did not look up. He sat with a lethal, predatory stillness, one hand resting loosely on the armrest, his fingers drumming a slow, silent rhythm. He was larger than any alpha she had ever seen, his broad shoulders filling the space, emanating a raw power that made the air feel thin. Then, the scent hit her. It wasn't the cloying musk of the banquet hall or the sharp cologne Jax wore. It was the smell of a deep forest after a storm, clean rain, wet earth, and cedar. It was a scent that bypassed her fear and went straight to her core, making her wolf whimper in her chest. It was intoxicating. Alara's hand shook so badly the wine bottle clinked against the crystal goblet. She bit her lip, terrified she would spill it. "My lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your wine." The king stopped drumming his fingers. He slowly turned his head. Alara found herself staring into an abyss. His face was hard, carved from granite and shadow, but it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were cold, calculating, and empty of mercy. He looked at her not as a servant, but as a curiosity, something out of place. She tipped the bottle, the dark red liquid swirling into the glass. Her focus wavered as that scent of rain and cedar wrapped around her, pulling her in. She leaned closer than she meant to, and as she pulled the bottle away to catch a drip, the back of her hand brushed against his knuckles. The contact was immediate and violent. A jolt of electricity arced through the room, snapping loud enough to be heard over the distant music. It wasn't just a spark, it was a lightning strike that traveled up her arm and exploded in her chest, knocking the breath out of her. Alara gasped, the bottle slipping from her numb fingers. Before the glass could shatter on the floor, a hand shot out, blurringly fast. Alaric didn't catch the bottle. He caught her. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, his grip like iron. The heat from his skin seared through her, hotter than fire, freezing her in place. Alara looked up, terrified, expecting to see anger. Instead, the darkness in his eyes was gone. They were no longer the color of slate. They were glowing a bright, piercing neon blue, the mark of a Leakin recognizing his own. "Mine," he rumbled, the word vibrating through her bones like a command. The crash of the wine bottle hitting the stone floor shattered the silence, spraying crimson liquid across the hem of Alara's white dress like a fresh wound. But Alara didn't flinch. She couldn't move even if she wanted to. The heat radiating from King Alaric's hand on her wrist was the only thing anchoring her to reality, a burning tether in a room that had suddenly spun off its axis. The musicians on the balcony stopped playing, their instruments falling silent in a discordant jumble. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room as the pack watched the impossible. The servant girl, the rejected Omega, was touching the king. King Alaric, Alpha Jax's voice boomed, slicing through the tension. He stepped forward, his face twisted in a mask of annoyance rather than fear. He was too arrogant to smell the change in the air, too blinded by his own wedding day to see the predator uncoiling in the dark. Forgive the girl. She is clumsy and broken. I will have her removed immediately. Alaric didn't look at Jax. He didn't even blink. His neon blue gaze remained locked on Alara's face, tracing the curve of her jaw as if memorizing a map. Removed? Alaric repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a low rumble of thunder. With a sudden, violent jerk, Alaric pulled. Alara gasped as she was lifted off her feet. The world blurred, and she landed hard against a wall of solid muscle. It took her a second to realize she was sitting on his lap, her legs draped over his thighs, completely engulfed by his massive frame. His arm snaked around her waist, locking her against him with a possessiveness that bordered on painful. The banquet hall erupted in shock. Silverware clattered to plates. Several lunas covered their mouths. To touch a king was treason, to sit on his throne, on his lap, was unheard of. You force a queen to serve you slop at your own wedding? Alaric growled, his voice rising just enough to vibrate against Alara's spine. He looked up then, finally pinning Jax with those glowing, terrifying eyes. And you dare to call her clumsy? Jax stopped dead in his tracks, his face flushing a deep, angry red. His ego flared, overriding his survival instinct. Your Majesty, this is a joke. That is no queen. That is Alara. She is wolfless. She is infertile. She is just a defective omega who cleans my floors. Jax sneered, reaching out as if to grab Alara's arm. Get down, girl. You are embarrassing yourself. The moment Jax's hand moved toward her, the air in the room vanished. A wave of pure, unadulterated power exploded from Alaric's body. It wasn't just authority, it was the ancient, crushing weight of a Leakan Alpha. It hit the room like a physical shockwave. Alara felt the pressure wash over her, but instead of crushing her, it shielded her. But for everyone else, it was devastating. Windows rattled in their frames. The candles were snuffed out instantly, plunging the room into twilight shadows illuminated only by the neon glow of Alaric's eyes. Kneel, Alaric whispered. It wasn't a request. It was biological law. Jax's knees hit the floor with a sickening crack. Behind him, his new bride collapsed, sobbing into her hands. The proud warriors, the sneering elders, the mocking guests, one by one, they were forced down by the invisible gravity of the king's aura, heads bowed, throats bared in submission. In the center of the devastation, Alaric remained seated, calm and terrifying. He ran his hand soothingly down Alara's trembling back, claiming her in front of the people who had tried to erase her. You called her defective, Alaric said, his voice echoing in the silent, terrified hall. He pressed a kiss to the pulse point of Alara's neck, marking her with his scent for all eternity. But the moon goddess does not make mistakes. And neither do I. She is my mate. Alaric didn't wait for the stunned silence to break. With Alara still gathered high in his arms, her legs tangled in the fabric of his suit, he turned his back on the kneeling assembly. He stepped off the dais, his heavy boots echoing against the stone floor, each footfall a gavel strike of finality. Alara buried her face in the crook of his neck, squeezing her eyes shut. She couldn't bear to look at them, at the elders who had scorned her, at the warriors who had left, or at Jax, who remained crushed against the floorboards by the sheer weight of the king's dominance. She expected a shout, a protest, anything to stop them, but the room remained a tomb of terrified submission. They passed through the double doors and into the biting chill of the night air. The sudden drop in temperature made Alara shiver, though the heat radiating from Alaric's chest kept the cold at bay. A sleek, armored limousine idled at the bottom of the packhouse stairs, its engine purring like a tamed beast. A uniformed driver scrambled to open the rear door, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. Alaric placed her on the soft leather seat with a gentleness that felt alien, then slid in beside her. The heavy door thudded shut, sealing them in a cocoon of silence and shadow. As the car began to move, putting distance between her and the only home she had ever known, the adrenaline that had sustained Alara suddenly crashed. The numbness vanished, replaced by a clawing, frantic panic. She was alone. With the Lycan King. The reality of what had just happened crashed down on her. She had caused a scene. She had humiliated an Alpha at his own wedding. She was an Omega, trained to be invisible, to serve, to never, ever be the center of attention. And now she was trapped in a moving metal box with the most dangerous predator on the continent. Alara scrambled backward until her spine pressed against the door, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling violently. "I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't ask for this. Please, my lord, I'll be good. I won't speak. I won't." She flinched violently when Alaric shifted in his seat, turning toward her. Her body braced for the blow. Jax had always hated when she cried. Tears were a sign of weakness that deserved to be punished. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sting of a backhand or the burn of a verbal lashing. "Alara." His voice wasn't a growl. It was deep, velvet soft, and laced with a confusion that halted her spiral. She opened one eye. Alaric wasn't raising his hand to strike her. He was reaching out, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying not to spook a wounded animal. His large, calloused thumb brushed against her cheekbone, just below her eye. The touch was feather-light, a stark contrast to the iron grip he had used to claim her moments ago. He swiped gently, wiping away a smudge of kitchen such she hadn't even known was there. "You are shaking," he observed quietly, looking at his thumb where the gray smudge now sat, then back at her wide, terrified eyes. I ruined the wedding," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "Jax will be furious." Alaric's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek, but his anger wasn't directed at her. He leaned in, closing the distance between them, but instead of crowding her, he simply took her cold, trembling hand in his warm ones. "Jax is nothing," Alaric said, the finality of his tone cutting through her fear like a blade. He looked at her not with the disdain she was used to, but with a fierce, burning protectiveness that made her breath hitch. "You are not a servant who needs to beg for mercy, Alara. You are mine. And no one hurts what is mine." He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing them softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Breathe, little wolf. You are safe now." The drive ended at gates that looked like they had been forged by giants. As the limousine wound its way up the long, moonlit driveway, Alara pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the view of the sprawling stone fortress that was the Lycan Palace. It made Alpha Jax's pack house look like a garden shed. When the car stopped, Alaric didn't wait for the driver. He opened her door and offered his hand. This time, Alara took it, though her fingers still trembled. She expected to be led to the servants' quarters, perhaps to a basement cell until he decided what use she was to him. Instead, he led her up the grand staircase, past bowing guards who didn't dare lift their eyes, and down a corridor lined with portraits of ancient kings. He stopped in front of double mahogany doors at the very end of the hall. "This is yours," Alaric said, pushing the doors open. Alara stepped inside and stopped dead. The suite was larger than the entire floor of the Omega dormitory she had lived in for years. A fireplace crackled with warm, inviting logs. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a snow-dusted garden. And in the center of the room sat a bed, a massive, four-poster expanse of silk and down that looked like a cloud. The luxury didn't comfort her, it terrified her. In Alara's world, nothing was free. Comfort was a currency, and the cost was usually pain or servitude. She turned to Alaric, her hands clutching the skirt of her stained white dress. The panic that had subsided in the car came rushing back, choking her. "My lord," she whispered, her eyes darting to the bed and then down to her worn shoes. I don't know the schedule. Do you want me to start cleaning now? Or Or do you require me to? Her voice trailed off, unable to say the words, but her hands moved instinctively to the top button of her dress. Alaric moved faster than she could blink. He didn't grab her, he gently covered her hands with his own, stopping her fingers from undoing the button. Alara, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. What are you doing? I know how this works, she said, tears pricking her eyes again. For a room like this, for saving me, there is a payment. I'm not a Luna, I know that. So I must be. Stop. The command was soft, but it silenced her instantly. Alaric looked devastated. The glowing blue in his eyes dimmed to a deep, sorrowful navy. He looked at her hands, rough from years of scrubbing floors, and then at her face, realizing just how deep the damage went. You think I brought you here to be a maid? He asked quietly. Or a whore? Alara flinched at the word, but she didn't deny it. That was what Jax had told her she was worth. Alaric let out a long breath, releasing her hands. He walked over to the massive bed. Alara braced herself, waiting for him to order her onto it. Instead, he grabbed a heavy quilt and 2 pillows. You are not a servant, Alaric stated firmly, turning back to her. And you are not payment. You are my mate. Your only duty in this palace is to breathe, to eat, and to heal. You are free to do absolutely nothing for the rest of your life if that is what you wish. He walked past her, not toward the bed, but toward the door. He threw the quilt onto the rug directly in front of the entrance, the threshold. My lord? Alara asked, bewildered. What are you doing? Alaric kicked off his boots and lay down on the floor, blocking the exit with his massive body. He punched the pillow into shape and looked up at her, his expression utterly serious. I am sleeping here, he said, crossing his arms over his chest. No one comes in. No one hurts you. And I stay right here, where you can see me, so you know I will not touch you until you ask me to. He closed his eyes, settling into the hard floor as if it were a throne. Sleep, little wolf. You are safe. Alara stood in the center of the room, surrounded by golden silk, staring at the most powerful king in the world sleeping on a rug like a guard dog, just so she wouldn't be afraid. For the first time in her life, the tears that fell weren't from fear, but from relief. The wedding flowers were already wilting in the heat of the pack house, their petals turning brown and curling at the edges, much like the mood of the pack itself. It had been less than a week since King Alaric had shattered the ceremony, and the humiliation still clung to the walls like a foul scent. Alpha Jack sat in his office, staring at a stack of unread reports. The room was cold. The fire in the hearth had burned down to ash, and there was no one to relight it. Alara used to do that. Alara used to do everything. Are you going to sulk in here all day? Jax looked up as Lena, his new bride and Luna, swept into the room. She was beautiful, sharp-angled and polished, wearing a silk robe that cost more than Alara's life earnings. But her beauty was like a blade, cold and hard. She didn't look at the empty grate or the pile of work. She looked at her reflection in the window. The council is asking questions, Jax, she said, examining her nails. They say the pack is restless. The pups are crying at night. The warriors are snapping at each other during training. It's embarrassing. It's an adjustment period, Jax grunted, rubbing his temples. A headache had been throbbing behind his eyes since the moment Alaric's limousine drove away. It's because the house feels dead, Lena snapped, turning to him. The Omegas are useless without supervision. They're running around like headless chickens. Fix it, Jax. I didn't marry you to manage a house of squalling brats and incompetent servants. She turned on her heel and left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames. Jack stared at the closed door, his jaw clenching. He realized with a sinking feeling that Lena was right, though he would never admit it to her. The pack was unraveling. He had underestimated just how much Alara had done. It wasn't just the cleaning or the cooking, it was her presence. She had been a natural soother, an omega whose scent naturally calmed the aggressive instincts of the dominant wolves. Without her, the pack was a powder keg waiting for a spark. He stood up and paced the room, his anger shifting from Lena to Alaric. The king had stolen his property. Alara was his rejection. His servant. She belonged to this pack. He thinks he can just take what he wants, Jax muttered, his eyes landing on the bookshelf behind his desk. But even a king is bound by the old laws. He pulled down a heavy, leather-bound tome, the Treaty of Sovereignty. It was the ancient agreement between the royal line and the independent packs. Jax flipped through the pages frantically, searching for a weakness, a technicality, anything that could override the king's claim. He read through mating laws, territory disputes, and challenge rights. Nothing. The mate bond trumped almost everything. He was about to hurl the book across the room when his finger stopped on a small, dusty paragraph in the appendix, the clause of ancestral debt. No wolf may be removed from their birth pack, even by royal decree or mating bond, if said wolf holds a significant, unresolved financial or blood debt to their alpha. The debt must be cleared before the wolf is released. A slow, wicked smile spread across Jax's face. Alara was an orphan. The pack had paid for her food, her clothes, and her shelter for 20 years. She had never paid them back. In his mind, her servitude had been interest, not repayment. He grabbed a fountain pen and a fresh sheet of parchment. "You want to play by the rules, Alaric?" Jax whispered, the tip of the pen scratching loudly against the paper. "Fine. But she doesn't leave until she pays the bill." He began to write, fabricating a number so high that even a king would hesitate to pay it, and if Alaric refused to pay, by law, Alara would have to come home to work it off. 3 weeks in the Leakin Palace had done more than feed Alara's body, it had resurrected her soul. She stood before the tall mirror in her suite, hardly recognizing the woman staring back. Gone was the stained, ill-fitting white cotton that had marked her as a servant. In its place, she wore a gown of deep midnight blue, the color of the royal house, trimmed with silver thread that caught the morning light. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, and the perpetual shadow of fear in her eyes had been replaced by a tentative, blossoming peace. She wasn't just a guest here, she was becoming a part of the palace's heartbeat. Alara left her room and made her way down to the kitchens. Old habits died hard, and she found it impossible to sit idle while others worked. At first, the staff had been terrified of her, expecting the same cruelty they received from most high-ranking wolves. But Alara had disarmed them with simple kindness. She remembered the cook's daughter's name, she helped the elderly gardener carry heavy sacks of soil, she thanked every maid who entered her room. As she passed a young servant girl struggling with a heavy basket of linens, Alara didn't hesitate. "Here, let me take that end," Alara said, grabbing the wicker handle. "Oh no, my lady." "You mustn't," the girl gasped, eyes widening. "The king would have my head if he saw you working." "The king has strong hands, but he isn't here," Alara winked, helping the girl heave the basket onto a table. "Besides, heavy burdens are lighter when shared." The girl beamed, and Alara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was a different kind of power than Jax possessed. It wasn't commanded, it was given freely. Later that afternoon, seeking solitude, Alara wandered into the private royal gardens. It was a sanctuary of white roses and moonflowers, hidden from the rest of the world by high stone walls. The air smelled sweet and safe. For the first time in years, Alara felt a song rising in her throat. It was a melody her mother had hummed to her before the orphanage, before the servitude, before the pain. She closed her eyes, tilting her face up to the sun, and let the notes fall from her lips. Her voice was clear and hauntingly beautiful, weaving through the trellis of roses. She didn't hear the footsteps on the stone path. King Alaric stood under the archway, frozen. He had come looking for her to share news of the border patrols, but the sight of her stole the words from his tongue. He had seen her terrified, he had seen her broken, and he had seen her sleeping. But he had never seen her free. Her voice wrapped around his heart, tightening the mate bond until it was an ache so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. She wasn't just a mate he had claimed to save, she was the missing piece of his soul, the light to his shadow. Alara sensed him before she saw him. The scent of rain and cedar drifted on the breeze, silencing her song. She opened her eyes to find him watching her, his expression raw with adoration. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Alaric said, his voice rough. He walked toward her, not with the predator's stalk he used in court, but with the reverence of a pilgrim approaching a shrine. "I have never heard anything so beautiful." "It's just an old song," Alara murmured, blushing, but she didn't step back. The instinct to run was gone. Alaric stopped inches from her. He reached out, his large hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing her lower lip. The electricity between them hummed, warm and inviting. "You are not just a song, Alara," he whispered. "You are the music." He leaned down slowly, giving her every second to pull away, to say no. He waited until her lashes fluttered shut, until she tilted her chin up in silent invitation. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a devouring claim. It was a question, and an answer. It was soft, tender, and overwhelmingly sweet. Alara sighed into the kiss, her hands rising to grip the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer. For the first time in her life, she wasn't serving a man, or fearing him. She was choosing him. And in the safety of his arms, amidst the scent of roses and rain, Alara finally felt like a queen. The peace of the palace was shattered not by an army's war horn, but by the bureaucratic squeak of a fountain pen on parchment. The massive oak doors of the throne room were thrown open without announcement. A dozen royal guards bristled, hands flying to their weapons, but they held their ground as Alpha Jack strode in. He wasn't alone. Flanking him were 5 withered, stone-faced elders, the keepers of the ancient laws, and behind them, a scribe clutching a rolled scroll. Alara, seated on a velvet stool beside Alaric's throne, felt the blood drain from her face. She smoothed the silk of her midnight blue gown, her fingers trembling. Jax looked smug, his chest puffed out, no longer the cowering man who had knelt at his own wedding. He had found a shield stronger than steel, the law. King Alaric didn't move from his throne, but the temperature in the room plummeted. Shadows seemed to lengthen and twist around him. His eyes, previously warm as he looked at Alara, snapped to a violent, glowing neon blue. "You have a death wish, pup." Alaric's voice was a low, vibrating hum that rattled the stained glass windows. "To enter my home uninvited is an act of war." "I am not here for war, Your Majesty," Jax said smoothly, stopping well out of clawing range. He gestured to the elders. "I am here for justice. And to collect on a debt." Jax snapped his fingers. The scribe hurried forward, unrolling the parchment with shaking hands. Under Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Treaty of Sovereignty, Jax recited, his eyes locking onto Alara with a possessive sneer that made her skin crawl. "No wolf may be removed from their birth pack if they hold an unresolved financial debt. Until that debt is paid, the wolf remains the property of the Alpha." "Property," Alaric spat, gripping the armrests of his throne until the wood splintered. "She is my queen. She is an orphan who lived on my pack's charity for 20 years, Jax countered, his voice dripping with false pity. "Food, shelter, clothing. We have calculated the total. It is substantial." He nodded to the scribe, who read the figure aloud. It was an astronomical sum, enough to bankrupt a small dukedom. It was a lie, a fabrication, but it was stamped with the elder's seal. "If you refuse to pay," Jax continued, his smile widening, "then by law, she must return with me to work it off. If you keep her by force, you break the treaty. The other packs will revolt. You will be a king of nothing." It was a trap. A perfect, legal cage. Alaric slowly stood up. The sound of his growl was terrifying, a primal sound of pure destruction. His muscles bunched, his claws extending, tearing through the tips of his gloves. He was going to kill them. He was going to rip Jax apart right here on the rug, treaty be damned. And in doing so, he would plunge the kingdom into civil war. "I will bathe this room in your blood," Alaric roared, stepping down from the dais. The elders gasped, retreating a step. Jax paled but held his ground, gambling everything on Alaric's crown being heavier than his rage. Alara watched Alaric. She saw the beast taking over, the blind fury that would destroy everything he had built just to keep her. She realized then that he couldn't fight this battle. His strength was his weakness here. But she was no longer the girl in the white cotton dress. Alara stood up. "Alaric, stop." Her voice was soft, but it cut through the tension like a bell. She walked past the king, placing a hand on his heaving chest. The sparks of their bond flared, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of the abyss. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "Do not stain your floor for him," she whispered. "He isn't worth it." Alaric looked down at her, his chest heaving, the blue fire in his eyes warring with the love he held for her. "I will not let him take you." "He won't," Alara said. She turned away from her mate and walked down the steps of the dais, moving with a grace she had learned in the last 3 weeks. She stopped directly in front of Jax. She was smaller than him, weaker than him, but she didn't flinch. She stared into the eyes of her tormentor, the man who had defined her worth for her entire life. "You want to talk about debts, Jax?" Alara asked, her voice steady and cold as winter ice. "Then let's talk about the bill." "Let's talk about the bill," Alara repeated, her voice ringing clear in the cavernous throne room. Jax scoffed, crossing his arms. "There is nothing to discuss. Room and board for 20 years. You were a leech on my pack." "A leech?" Alara turned to the elders, her midnight blue silk rustling softly. "Honored elders, does the law of ancestral debt apply to employees?" One of the elders, a gray-furred wolf with clouded eyes, cleared his throat. "It does not. Wages must be paid. A laborer owes no debt for their bread." "I see," Alara said. She turned back to Jax, her gaze hardening. "For 7 years, since I turned 13, I was the head housekeeper of your pack house. I cooked 3 meals a day for 200 wolves. I scrubbed the floors until my hands bled. I mended the warriors' uniforms. I even polished the silver tray I used to serve you at your wedding." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. No holidays. No sick days. And you paid me nothing." The court fell deadly silent. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Slavery was strictly forbidden by the High Council. It was a crime punishable by stripping an alpha of his rank. "She lies." Jax snarled, sweat beading on his forehead. "She was family. It was chores." "Family eats at the table, Jax," Alara shot back, her voice rising with the force of her suppressed anger. "I ate scraps in the kitchen. Family wears clothes, not rags. And family isn't forced to serve wine to their mate's new bride." She turned to the royal scribe, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Scribe, what is the standard annual wage for a head of domestic staff in a royal territory?" "Approximately 40,000 gold marks, my queen," the scribe stuttered. "And for 7 years?" Alara asked. 280,000. Plus interest." Alara turned back to Jax. The number was triple what he had demanded from Alaric. "It seems, Alpha Jax, that you owe me." The elders looked at the parchment in Jax's hand, then at the trembling Alpha. The gray-furred elder stepped forward, snatching the scroll from Jax's grip. "This claim is void," he announced, his voice disgusted. "And you are under investigation for violation of labor laws, Alpha." The humiliation was too much. Jax's composure snapped. With a feral roar, he shifted, his bones cracking as he lunged for Alara, his human fingers curling into claws aimed at her throat. "I will kill you, you worthless." The threat was never finished. There was a blur of motion, a gust of wind, and a sickening crunch. Alaric didn't shift. He didn't need to. He moved with supernatural speed, catching Jax by the throat in midair and slamming him into the marble floor with enough force to crack the stone. Jax gasped, pinned like an insect, Alaric's hand crushing his windpipe. The king stood over him, eyes glowing with murderous blue light, his other hand raised to deliver the killing blow. Alaric! Alara's voice was sharp. The king froze, his claws inches from Jax's chest. He looked up at her, his chest heaving. He tried to touch you. He dies. No, Alara said, walking over to stand over the defeated Alpha. She looked down at Jax, not with fear, and not with hate. She looked at him with indifference. He was small. He was pathetic. He wasn't a monster, he was just a bully who had lost his playground. Death is too easy, Alara said calmly. If you kill him, he becomes a martyr. Then what is your judgment, my queen? Alaric asked, his grip tightening on Jax's throat. Alara met Jax's terrified gaze. I want him to live. I want him to live with the knowledge that the weak Omega he threw away is sitting on a throne he can never touch. She pointed to the doors. Exile. Stripped of his rank, his pack, and his name. He wanders the roguelands until the winter takes him. Alaric smiled, a dark, proud thing. He held Jax up by his collar and threw him toward the guards. You heard the queen. Get this trash out of my sight. The bells of the Leakin Palace tolled across the snow-covered valley, a deep, resonant sound that didn't signal a warning, but a welcome. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the scent of winter roses and anticipation. It was a stark contrast to the last time Alara had faced a crowd like this. Back then, the air had smelled of stale fear and cheap champagne. Today, it smelled of hope. Alara sat on the throne of obsidian and velvet, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. She wore white. But this was not the rough, stained cotton of a servant's uniform, worn to mock her innocence. This was liquid silk, shimmering like moonlight against her skin, embroidered with pearls that caught the candlelight. On her brow rested a crown of woven white gold and diamonds, heavy with history but light on her head. She had reclaimed the color. It was no longer the color of surrender, it was the color of a blank page, a new beginning. Beside her, King Alaric sat not as a terrifying shadow, but as a partner. He wore his ceremonial armor, black and imposing, but his hand was inextricably linked with hers, his thumb brushing soothing circles over her knuckles. The high priest finished the blessing, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Long live the queen! Long live the queen, the court roared back, a thunderous sound of genuine loyalty that shook the floorboards. There were no sneers today, no mocking whispers. The elders bowed low, the warriors pounded their chests. As the cheers died down and the music of the feast began, a hush fell over the high table. Alaric stood up. The room went instantly silent, watching their king. He didn't reach for his goblet, nor did he signal the servants to fill the cups. Instead, he walked to the side table where the wine rested in a crystal decanter. Alara watched him, her heart skipping a beat. The memory of the wedding washed over her, the shame, the shaking tray, the terrifying walk into the shadows. Alaric picked up the decanter. He walked toward her, moving with the same predatory grace he always possessed, but his eyes were soft, glowing with that familiar, warm blue light. He stopped before her throne. The most powerful predator in the kingdom, the king who had brought alphas to their knees with a single growl, slowly lowered himself. He went down on one knee, bowing his head in reverence, placing himself lower than her. He poured the deep red wine into her goblet, his hand steady and sure. The liquid swirled, dark and rich. My lord, Alara whispered, her throat tight with emotion. You do not serve. Alaric looked up, his gaze locking with hers. He placed the decanter down and took the goblet in his hands, offering it to her. I serve those I love, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I serve my queen. Alara reached out, her fingers brushing his, no sparks of pain this time, only the warm, humming connection of a bond that had survived the fire. She took the glass from him, her fingers lingering on his. To the future, she whispered, a smile touching her lips. To us, Alaric replied. He pressed a kiss to her hand, and as Alara took the first sip, the hall erupted in cheers, closing the circle forever. The servant girl was gone. The queen had risen.